Alisha Holland is a professor in the government department at Harvard University. She's working on a new book on infrastructure investment in Latin America and is a specialist in the Andean region. Today on Faculty Voices, we'll be talking about Ecuador. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, earlier this year, organized crime groups totally paralyzed Ecuador. It was described by its president as a quote, internal armed conflict. But with all the news from Venezuela and the US election, we haven't heard much about what's going on in that country. So, for decades, Ecuador, a small nation of 18 million people, was generally regarded as a peaceful, stable place, at least by regional standards. And in the past 2 years, the homicide rate has more than tripled, making it the highest in Latin America. What happened, Alicia?
This is a question lots of analysts are asking. So, a few factors I think contributed to rising criminal activity in Ecuador. So, the first is sort of perversely, many people blame the peace agreements with the FARC in Colombia. So, when Colombia finally negotiated a peace agreement with the FARC, it meant that an important source of control over the drug trade and drug production really broke down. Many people think that the FARC had pretty pretty tight control over both the supply chains and trafficking routes and some of the ports. So that opened up space for new actors to produce coca, to traffic coca, and left a bit of a vacuum as the FARC itself demobilized. And so that's one factor that probably contributed to Ecuador being a site of additional drug trafficking. A second important factor has to do with port security. So a couple of things changed here. So some people think part of it was Colombia really tightened security around its ports, which are, important exit points for cocaine, and particularly, I should say, for the cocaine market to Europe. So Ecuador has become, according to many accounts, the largest supplier to European cocaine markets. And a lot of that has to do with the changing management of the ports, also changes in the US control of some of Ecuador's main ports. So that's a second factor that put Ecuador on a new set of drug trafficking routes, and particularly the cocaine supply routes to Ecuador, out to Europe, excuse me. And then the third really important factor is the movement of Mexican drug cartels farther south. So it's unclear exactly why this happened at the moment that it did, but there are growing reports of, in particular, the Sinaloa cartel, but also the Gulf cartel, moving into countries like Ecuador. They're also being seen, I should say, in northern Peru, some reports in Chile. And this means that there is immense competition in the criminal market in Ecuador. So they're both Mexican cartels, there are domestic Ecuadorian cartels, some of which have linked with the Mexican cartels. There's also reports of Albanian cartels. And what most analysts think is that competition among criminal organizations is one of the main drivers of violence. And I think that is a huge part of the violence you're seeing in Ecuador. And you can see that both from the geographic patterns. So, the most violent municipalities really are those by the key ports and the drug trafficking routes in Ecuador. And also, you can see it in the types of crimes that are being committed and the ways in which responsibility is being attributed. So, some of the assassinations from, the presidential candidate who we talked about the last time I was on Faculty Voices, Fernando Villavicencio, but also mayors in municipalities that govern key parts of the trafficking routes. Those all have the fingerprints, I would say, of larger drug cartels that really care about their ability to do business.
Is Ecuador's young president, Daniel Noboa, managing to control the penetration of organized crime?
It is an extremely hard problem. So Noboa came to the presidency on the promise that he would take a very hardline approach, bring in the military to fight the drug cartels, to regain control of the prisons. And, one of his first acts in office was to declare a state of exception to allow for a more militarized approach to security. It has not produced dramatic changes in homicide rates. If anything, many municipalities have actually grown more violent over the past year. There have been, major violent incidents both in the prisons and, some, including the stormed, armed takeover of a television station, that have made apparent the extent to which large, violent criminal organizations are fighting for control of the country. So Noboa had a very hard task. I think Ecuadorians, partially because of the reputation for being a peaceful country that you first started talking about, really had hoped that this would be solved in the short term. Noboa also sometimes positions himself and compares himself to the Salvadoran president, Nayib Bukele, who made these tremendous security gains. And Ecuador has not seen similar results from its militarized policing approach. And I would say part of that is that it is facing an extremely hard problem that is going to persist for many years, if not decades.
This spring, the Ecuadorian government raided the Mexican embassy in Quito to seize a convicted former vice president. This move, which I'd call radical, because a Latin American democratic nation doesn't generally do that, prompted Mexico to suspend diplomatic relations. So, what impact did this raid have both internationally and domestically?
Mm-hmm. So this is a fascinating case, and as you said, it's really a kind of amazing international incident. Let me put it in domestic perspective. Why would Noble raid the embassy? So a lot of it has to do with the centrality of the former vice president, Jorge Glass, both in terms of his relationship with very popular, or still quite popular, former president Rafael Correa, and also the accusations that it was really Glass that managed relations with drug cartels and potentially contributed to the entrance, particularly of Mexican drug cartels, to the Ecuadorian market. So Glass, to start with the first point, was Correa's right-hand man, vice president. I'm working on this book on infrastructure. Glass shows up all the time in sort of corrupt contracts with the Brazilian construction firm Odebrecht. He was prosecuted for having received more than $13 million in bribes from Odebrecht. So he's at the center of a major corruption scandal associated with the Correa government. And I think in a lot of ways took the fall for a lot of the corruption that was associated with Correa's Revolución Ciudadana. The trickier part, and I think what actually motivated the current decision to move on the Mexican embassy, has to do with the ways in which cartels are starting to penetrate the judiciary, and potentially are the ways in which Correa's movement is also seen as responsible for some of the drug politics occurring in Ecuador. So it's a little bit of a tricky case, but let me just walk you through what I think, we sort of know about what happened, which is basically, I think it was about 2023, so, about a year ago, Blas is conditionally released after he had been convicted on these corruption charges. And he's released by a judge who many people think was basically paid off by one of the major drug cartels. And there's kind of a range of evidence in this case, testimonies coming out of prison that, Correa was talking to this drug cartel and arranging for the release of Glass. But basically, the sense is organized crime was responsible for Glass's release from prison. And so I think for Noboa, this is seen as if he truly wants to fight the influence of cartels on the Ecuadorian criminal justice system, he has to make sure Glass remains in prison and can't allow for this type of bribery to occur of judges, of Correa's political movement negotiating with cartels. And so this case becomes central for Noboa's fight against the cartels and also a kind of proxy fight against Correa's political movement, Revolución Ciudadana. So in that sense, it is very much motivated, I would say, by domestic politics and concerns about cartel influence, the reputation Noboa has for going against the cartels. And the complicated part, of course, about its reception internally is that it is partially seen as, very politically motivated, trying to continue to persecute, former politicians like Glass. Internationally, this is, widely condemned. Storming an embassy, removing somebody is obviously anathema to international law and protocols. And again, I think the main reason that it was done is that AMLO, the Mexican president, was seen as sympathetic and at the verge of granting amnesty to Glass, which would have further empowered the Mexican cartels and Correa himself. So it's a complicated case, a strange case, but I think it's central in many ways to understanding the sort of intertwining of drug politics and cartel desires to really take over Ecuadorian state institutions. And at the same point, the intertwining of Correa's political movement, Revolución Ciudadana, and the sort of electoral forces that continue to see themselves as fighting against that movement.
But doesn't alienating Mexico mean that there can't be any collaboration in terms of trying to control Mexican drug cartels?
That's fascinating. I do think that, the international cost both comes from alienating Mexico and from the United States. This is a time when Ecuador is incredibly dependent on American funding, on American military supplies. And so, sort of raiding the embassy of what still remains, an important US ally has high costs internationally. I don't know how much Mexican authorities, and obviously there's also been a change in government in Mexico, are sharing information and are central to the prosecution of Mexican cartels operating in Ecuador. But I do think putting the alliance with the US on edge, given its centrality to funding Ecuador's fight against the cartels, has a really high cost. And again, I see Noboa's move as motivated entirely by the domestic political considerations and with an eye to the upcoming election, to the point that he was willing to take on those high costs of alienating the Mexican government and by proxy angering the US government as well.
The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has projected that Ecuador has the worst rate of growth of any country in Latin America. How does that feel on the ground? Is there popular dissent? From a policy perspective, how is Noboa handling this?
Yeah, the economic situation in Ecuador is dire. And I think that the overall mood in the country, due to the combination of insecurity and economic decline, is really pessimistic. Neither the security situation nor the economic situation have short-term fixes. And many of those short-term fixes, I should also say, are quite unpopular, especially when you think about the sort of economic reforms that the IMF has been pushing. So, Novoa and the IMF negotiated yet another attempt to make real structural reforms to the economy. At the heart of that are subsidies for fuel in Ecuador. But if you remember back to the very large protests that occurred under the government of Lenin Moreno, they were basically motivated by trying to implement IMF recommendations to cut fuel subsidies. So Noboa, I would say, is, he's in a pickle. These are reforms that need to happen to continue to get IMF funding. On the other hand, they're reforms that will bring down pretty much any Ecuadorian government, and especially at a time of a lot of economic malaise, are very difficult to implement. Um, a lot of Ecuador's bet has actually been on China. So one important piece of news is that Noboa signed a free trade agreement with China this past spring. And part of that was an attempt to, again, hope that China will be a source of loans and also loan forgiveness for a lot of large debts that Ecuador owes to China. Environmentalists were extremely upset by the free trade agreement with China. There are what I would say are quite worrisome clauses in the agreement, including, the dumping of used pharmaceuticals in Ecuador. There were a lot of opposition among environmental groups to that agreement. The negotiations actually began under a quite unpopular president of Guillermo Lasso. So there were questions about whether Noboa might take a different tack, try to move closer to the US, or reject the agreement. But I honestly think he's in a pretty desperate economic situation. And given the challenges of really meeting the IMF's conditions, the hope that additional Chinese money could help him avoid making those reforms remains really important. I would also say this government, its main strategy has basically been silence. It does not say a lot in terms of, publishing jobs numbers or publishing homicide statistics. And I think on both security and the economy, it made big promises to generate employment, to generate growth, to improve the security situation. And those things have not happened and are very difficult to really turn around. And I think Noboa's strategy, in a lot of ways, in contrast to Bukele, has been to just be a bit silent about the key issues that Ecuadorians are worried about.
Are Ecuadorians leaving?
Yes, migration, remains a major issue. The state of the economy does mean that many Ecuadorians are migrating to the United States. If you look at the figures coming out of, for example, Panamanian migration authorities, Ecuadorians are, not a huge share, but they are an important share of the migrants who are crossing the Darien Gap and trying to get to the US. And I think that, again, is a reflection of both the economic situation and then also how it intertwines with the security situation. That means many Ecuadorians are simply losing hope. The other thing just to say about Ecuador's economy is that, it is a dollarized economy, which means that it has fewer tools to use in terms of fiscal policy to really turn things around. And also at the same point, obviously earning dollars abroad are incredibly valuable in terms of, remittances to families in Ecuador.
Let's get to the major blackouts. They began well before Noboa. They're not his fault, but what is he doing about it? And you're the infrastructure expert. Are there any improvements he's planning? Is it realistic to think he can get the energy situation under control?
Unfortunately, this is maybe the third major issue on which I see no real short term solution. Going back in time, Ecuador has had electricity shortages and challenges with blackouts since the 2000s, but actually, it really is electricity blackouts that even motivate Correa in 2008 to start investing in infrastructure. And more specifically, his plan was to invest in a number of major hydroelectric facilities. The story of those facilities is very linked to glass and corruption and China. I won't recount all of it here, but basically, those are projects that end up having immense operational problems. So many of them never come online. Those that are built are not producing the levels of electricity promised. And at the same point, one of the huge challenges is always the transmission of electricity. So even though there was this massive investment in its production that didn't fully become operational, the country also never solved the transmission challenges and invested in actually upgrading the grid. So we're seeing the consequences in a lot of ways of the mismanagement of massive investments that were made to confront just this problem, 15 years ago. And unfortunately, it's not an easy problem to solve. It's one that, the government has spent a lot of money trying to address. A lot of the tactics of Noboa, at least in the short run, resemble things that we actually saw from Korea. So, in addition to the security emergency, there is now an energy emergency in the country. Emergency orders allow for much more rapid contracting of both infrastructure and improvement projects. So Noboa, is trying to solve some of the problems at both the new facilities that were built as well as Ecuador's aging facilities. And, I think we'll make some progress. But this also intersects with the fact that the country is broke. It's really financially in very bad shape. It does not have the resources to make the types of infrastructural improvements that I think would really lead to resolving the energy crisis.
You talk about the country being broke. With the situation in Venezuela after the elections there, many people are saying that there's likely to be a new influx of Venezuelan immigrants into Ecuador. Is Ecuador prepared? What's its immigration policy? And is it likely to take a hard line or just swallow and welcome its neighbors?
That's such a great question. So I would say Ecuador is not prepared. A lot of the responses to existing waves of Venezuelan migrants have come from civil society groups, religious groups that are able to offer, more immediate aid. The fact that Ecuador is a dollarized economy in some ways makes it attractive. That's not to say employment is plentiful, but, there was a large wave of migration in part because the sense was, well, earning dollars, at least you could go a little farther. And so they earn more being sent back to Venezuela on the black market. So you'll run into many Venezuelan, Uber drivers and, anything where they can in the informal economy make a living. I think a lot of Ecuadorians, partially because of the security situation, also worry a lot about how migration intersects with the security challenges. So you both see rises in homicides and killings clearly linked to cartels. But a lot of Ecuadorian citizens are also complaining about more daily forms of crime. So just, street robberies, car thefts, break-ins, and those, whether true or not, often get scapegoated on Venezuelan migrants. And I think the real concern is if another wave comes, to what extent does some of the hostility and portrayal of Venezuelan migrants as criminals and contributing to insecurity then lead to a push to tighten borders much more strongly. You've already seen kind of some shifts in Ecuador's migration policy. Probably one of the most important things is Ecuador used to be one of the few countries that you could enter without a visa. So Ecuador was actually a huge jumping off point for not just Venezuelan migrants, but Chinese, African migrants from around the world that were coming to Ecuador due to its easy visa policy and then crossing the Darien Gap. So it has tightened its restrictions in some ways. And I think the bigger question is, if there's another big wave, do you see greater attempts to maybe follow the Mexican strategy of really using the military at the border, trying to close off land crossings, trying to deny kind of schooling and very basic benefits to Venezuelan migrants. My suspicion is it will be a topic in the upcoming Ecuadorian election, and certainly lots of people are watching closely to see what happens with the transition possibly in Venezuela, as well as the migration patterns that it might unleash if it remains under Maduro's control.
Well, now that we're on the subject of elections, is Noboa still considered the favorite to be reelected in Ecuador's next presidential election, which is scheduled for February 2025?
He still has a good shot. I would say the initial hopes for his administration have been in many ways dashed. He has kind of middling approval ratings at this point. In a lot of ways, it looks like it's going to be a rematch of the past election now. So Noboa just secured the nomination of his party. And I think it's this weekend, or maybe next week, is the primary for Revolución Ciudadana. From what I've heard, people expect that we're yet again going to see Luisa Gonzalez as a candidate for Revolución Ciudadana, which, there was a sort of complicated internal politics. Was it going to be Correa's older sister who actually would win the nomination? But it sounds like we're headed towards. And so, the country remains polarized. There's, a fraction of very loyal Correa supporters who I think with a certain degree of nostalgia for the boom period, would support a Gonzalez candidacy. At the same point, there are a lot of anti-Correa, voters who are never going to vote for Gonzalez. And the more interesting part is, that swing voter in the middle, basically. And you could divide that into a couple of, different blocks. So I mentioned the free trade movement, the free trade agreement with China, the anger of the environmentalists. There is a very important constituency of young Ecuadorians that care a lot about tourism and the environment and have often been mobilized into elections and votes against Revolución Ciudadana by environmental issues. Noboa, I think, has now been seen as a traitor to those environmental causes due to his links with China. So that's going to complicate, where young people vote, and more environmentally conscious young people vote, I think is not clear in a rematch between Noboa and Gonzalez. Probably they stay home. And on some of the other issues, I think both candidates are going to promise security improvements. They are going to promise, a hard take against crime and improvements in the economy. And I think at this point, the real question is how credible those promises are from either side. So I would not be surprised. Ecuador also has a two-round presidential system. I think some of the interesting action might actually come from what happened in that first round. Is there an outsider candidate? Is there an environmental leftist candidate who emerges, who's able to mobilize youth voters and sort of break the sort of polarization and sense of these are both establishment candidates who have failed. So that's what I'll be looking for, which I think it's too early to tell. But at the moment, we've got a rematch between what will be seen as very flawed candidates, and it's not clear to me who comes out ahead.
Thank you. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it, June.
You've been listening to Alisha Holland. She's professor in the government department at Harvard University and the specialist in the Andean region. Thank you so much for being with Faculty Voices, Alicia.
Thank you, June.